Today we're going to be talking about one of the most influential products of all time, and it is, of course, whiskey. Sweet amber nectar. No, sorry, it's the Golf. I meant the Golf. Did I say the Golf? I meant the Golf. Let's talk about the Golf. Hello and welcome to the Car Nerd Talks. I am the aforementioned Car Nerd. I'm not going to jump too much into this, but today we're going to be talking about a very famous car, by which I am of course talking about the Volkswagen Golf. Now without further ado, like, subscribe, and let's jump straight into it. So by the time the 1950s came around, Volkswagen was already looking for a replacement for the Volkswagen Beetle, and that makes sense because the Volkswagen Beetle was already 20 years old by the time 1955 rolled around, having been introduced by Herr Hitler in 1935. And the Volkswagen Corporation was far too reliant on this one car in its lineup, so it started looking further afield for new ways to replace the Beetle and make some money. So they started a lot of internal projects known as the EA projects, or Entwicklungsauftrag. I don't speak much German. If that was wrong, please tell me in the comments. But anyway, let's move on, yeah. And this stood for development. This stood for development assignment, of course, as you know if you speak German. So throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, they had a lot of these developed, including 11 of these prototypes from famed auto house designer Pininfarina, along with a load of different ones between the 1950s all the way up to 1971 from Porsche themselves, and of course Ghia. Now the Porsche designs ended up becoming the Type 3 or the Volkswagen 1600, and the Ghia design went on to become a design which was designed to be the I really need to get an auto cue. Yes, the Volkswagen de Brasilia. So the Volkswagen Brasilia was the one that was inspired by the Ghia. So what they realized was that while they were looking for a replacement for the Beetle, they were offshooting a lot of these cars into other different cars and expanding the Volkswagen brand into various different things like sedans, sports cars, buses, all this sort of thing. So it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but they were still rushing to find a replacement for the Beetle. And this would become very, very necessary in the early 70s. The reason for this is that between 1969 and 1971, the company had gone from 300 million Deutschmark profit a year to 12 million Deutschmark profit a year, and the reason for this was intense competition from other manufacturers meant that the Beetle wasn't as popular as it had always been, and a lot of the sales were in other countries like Mexico, where it was becoming a popular choice, but not back in Vaterland. So in 1971, Rudolf Leitling took over the company as chairman and managing director, and he said that the situation with Volkswagen was way more critical than they had once thought. So even though they had expanded into various fields of different products like the Type 3 and so on, and they had started launching things like the Passat and the Scirocco, they were worried that they weren't doing this fast enough and that they hadn't got a product that they could sell millions of as quickly as possible. So he started looking for which product it would be. Luckily for them, a couple of years earlier, some bigwigs, including Lotz, the previous director, had gone to the Turin Auto Show for no wait, that's Italian. Doesn't matter. They had gone to the Turin Auto Show and they had found 6 of their favorite cars that they absolutely loved. And of these 6, 4 of them were designed by one man, which was a good sign. It meant this fella knew what he was doing, and this fella worked, or indeed owned, Ital Design. And can you guess his name? If you can guess it, put it in the comments. You have 3 seconds while I look up the answer. The man, of course, was Giugiaro, who is the famed designer of various cars throughout the year, and was the guy who invented the folding paper design, or the origami design of cars. They loved these cars so much that they went and they destroyed all but 2 of the 50 prototypes that Porsche was working on at the time. And they said to Giugiaro, "Amigo, you need to start building this." And I don't know why the Germans sound like that or Italians sound like that, so I'm gonna sip some whiskey and we're gonna move on fast. So Giugiaro went away with some simple instructions. This needed to be a C-segment car with a 2-box body and a 3-door or 5-door design. Obviously being a hatchback, because the hatchbacks had now become the popular thing thanks to the Renault 5, which you can watch here. So he went away with these simple design instructions, along with some dimensions, rudimentary, along with the engine choices that would go into the car, which we'll get onto in a few minutes. He came back with something absolutely epic, and these days this looks like a boxy car, I'm sure, but I can assure you this thing was absolutely mind-blowing in its day. What he came back with was, of course, his folded paper design with rectangular headlights, some nice and wide rear tail lamps, and just boxy figure overall, but it looked awesome. They decided this thing was so cool they were going to put it into production, but not before rounding off those headlights, narrowing out those tail lights, and smoothing off some of the edges, because that's what you do with production. You don't go with your crazy concept, because then you look like a whiskey swilling YouTuber who has no idea about cars. Giugiaro would go on to say that this was the most important design of his lifetime. However, do keep in mind that this wasn't his first release to production with Volkswagen, because the Scirocco, the first generation, and the Passat, the first generation, were also designed by this legend and happened to be put into production before the Golf, because the Golf was much more important. The game of This car was the most important thing, and that would come from, you've guessed it, the game of golf. Or did it? Now, the original car was going to be called either the Blizzard or the Carib, but the Volkswagen execs decided that they'd come up with a different name, and they went with the name Golf. Now, most have said that it comes from the game of golf, because this was kind of a wealthy person's game, and it was kind of a well-to-do person's game, so it was kind of like being the cheap member of the big golf society, as in you didn't need to spend much to attain the high life.
Ball is in. Parking lot. Would you like to play again? You have selected no.
So that would make sense, but it could also have been named after a horse, or it could have been named after the Gulf Stream, which in German is Golfstrom, so that also makes sense. In America it was called the Rabbit, which is a long hop from the game of golf. Get it? Get it? Long. Because rabbits, they Oh, I'm out of whiskey. Let's move on. In terms of engine choices, this car came with either a 1.1 litre or a 1.5 litre engine, which were transversely mounted in the front of the car, front wheel drive, and also they were water cooled. Now, if you want to learn more about a transverse engine, you can click this little video up here. I made it myself. I did. I think you might like it. So those two engines were not exactly the most powerful things you've ever heard of in your life, but you know what, this was the 1970s and it didn't fucking matter, if I'm honest with you. And yes, I cursed. If your kids are there, don't care, it's YouTube, just check the policies, bro. So the 1.1 engine came with 50 brake horsepower, which was massive for 1974 in such a small car, and of course the 70 horsepower over the top 1.5 litre engine, which both came from Audi. Now these engines, the 70 horsepower, would get you to 95 miles an hour and would take you an incredible 15 seconds to get to 60 from a standing start. However, a couple of years later, in 1976, Volkswagen would introduce one of the most beautiful things you've ever seen in your entire lifetime. And I am, of course, talking about the Mark I Golf GTI. Yeah. The original Golf GTI was a resounding success and was just absolutely loved by sports and racing enthusiasts everywhere who couldn't afford to buy something big. This was the working class hero that the Sierra would later on go on to be, and of course I mean the Sierra Cosworth, not the regular Sierra. This beefed up engine was taken out of an Audi A80 at the time, which was a 1.6 litre engine that the Volkswagen crew then finely tuned until they got it to put out 110 brake horsepower, which gave it a 0 to 60 of 9.2 seconds, which doesn't sound incredible, but in 1976, in a small hatchback, it was, and it would go on to a speed limit breaking 113 miles an hour, which is just a blast from the past. Goddamn flies. The result was an incredibly successful car. This car would go on to sell nearly 10 million The result was an incredibly successful car. This car would go on to sell 10 million units in its first 10 years between 1974 and 1985, when it was completely destroyed and the Golf was never seen again. Just kidding, they introduced the Mark II. However, it wasn't the end for the Mark I. Although it sold nearly 10 million units and 480,000 Golf GTIs in that time, it wasn't finished production in one place. In South Africa, this car was produced for 25 years, selling nearly 500,000 units to the South Africans. I can't do a South African accent. I used to be able to. You spot me, bro. I can't do it anymore. So that is my video on the Volkswagen Golf Mark I, and if you liked it and if you love Golfs, please let me know in the comments. Please hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next couple of days where I will be launching a video about the fastest production car of all time in 1931, the Duesenberg Mark J. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow, bro.